I'm Danny, and this is the AID podcast, otherwise known as Authentically Inspiring with Danny. Welcome to a space where we talk about the good times, but we don't shy away from difficult, taboo topics either. The goal of this podcast is to provide aid and healing in the form of storytelling and share insight from our life experiences. This podcast isn't self-help, nor does it set out to necessarily teach you anything, but rather to share a story and hear your own. Perhaps you learned something along the way. Long time no see, folks, but welcome back. I've been hard at work over the last few months reevaluating both my creative and business processes. Like with most new journeys, I didn't fully understand everything that was necessary to get this dream off the ground, yet alone maintain it. And suffice it to say, it has been overwhelming. I'm currently operating with 3 full-time jobs, one in the corporate world, one as a mother of twins, and one as a podcast host / entrepreneur. Now, I know being an entrepreneur comes with sacrifices, but rather than spend the last few months scrambling to create a half-assed new podcast episode for you, I spent that time reassessing how I could balance these 3 things along with healthy eating, getting enough sleep, working out, doing necessary tasks around the house, having a social life, and keeping myself mentally healthy. If you've listened to my podcast, you'd know why all of these things are important to me, especially being a mom available to my children and supporting my wife. As I assessed each of these things I needed to prioritize in my life, I realized I couldn't keep up with a 2-week release for podcast episodes and a social media presence. So I made the decision to reduce that to a monthly release for now, and we'll see what happens. Maybe I'll finally be able to manage all the social media necessary for this thing. Let's cover shoutouts real quick and welcome the new followers to the podcast on both Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks for joining us and sharing your precious time with me. I do deeply appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy this time as much as I do. We've got a new patron who's joined our journey, and speaking of, I've completely overhauled the Patreon space to begin including content for your use, as well as introducing 3 tiers of Patreon content. There's the AID Supporters tier, for those of you who want to help our mission spread and grow and support the podcast. There's the AID Discovery tier, for beginning your journey with access to limited special resources like active writing journal prompts, exercises that have helped me in life that I want to share with you, and special video guest podcasts, which are coming soon, by the way. If you want to be a guest or know of a guest, have a story to tell that you think could have really helped somebody, please contact me and let me know. And then there's the AID Together tier, the private and judgment-free community space that we're building to help navigate this world and its ups and downs. Come be part of the foundational crew that's putting it all together. If you're new, or maybe you forgot, let me quickly tell you what we're all about. I deeply believe in the power of community and the power that stories have to heal. I also have this wacky idea to combine the two into this podcast and a digital support community. I want to use the power of storytelling to help inspire and heal people through some of the hardest moments of their lives and show them that they are not alone in this world. While each experience is uniquely our own, there are similarities that can be shared to help one another. In this space, we are here to share our life experiences and learn and grow from them. If this sounds like something you'd be curious about, stay a while and listen. And be sure to check out patreon.com/the AID podcast for details on the digital support community. I spent so much time trying to brainstorm what felt right as the next story to tell. But the walls of my brain refused to come down and let the ideas flow. I thought having a format to the episodes would help me control all the ideas that swim around in my head, but I think it's actually limited me in my creative process. So in this next series, I'm going to experiment with removing the chains from that creativity and see what happens. Speaking of the next series, what is it, you may be asking? If you follow me on any of my social media channels, you already know. And if you're not following me yet, you really should. You can find me on Patreon, Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn, all by searching for the AID podcast. Our next series is on authenticity. Before we get started, let's talk potential trigger tags for this series because trauma dumping is real and that's not what we're trying to do here. We want to tell stories so that people may find learnings and solace in them, not more trauma. This series of episodes has potential triggers for depression, suicide, cutting, physical and emotional abuse, and abandonment. My wife had this great idea that I should share my coming out story, and I started thinking deeper on what that actually was like beyond the surface level. My sexuality is important to me, because as you'll hear about in the next few episodes, it took me a very long time to love and accept it. To accept myself. This seems to be changing, which is lovely, but for most queer people, we don't grow up authentically as ourselves. We move through the world pretending to be a different version of ourselves, sacrificing our authenticity in order to keep ourselves safe, avoid shame and humiliation, and discrimination for simply existing. One of my life's greatest hardships was unpacking what parts of me were truly and authentically me, and which parts were the lie I showed the world to protect myself. While I have known that my coming out story is very similar to many others, I thought the journey of how I slowly destroyed the closet around me would be helpful to many people who are struggling with their sexuality even now, here in 2024. Hell, there might be lessons you can take from this story that have nothing to do with sexuality, because, after all, authenticity covers a wide expanse of our identities. Truthfully, I couldn't think of something more authentic than what it was like to figure out who I was and who I wanted to be. But I realized later in life that I couldn't do the latter without doing the former. Hopefully, this story helps you realize that much faster than I did. For anyone who may not be aware, some of this terminology might be a little strange. Coming out of the closet essentially means declaring outwardly that you are in some aspect, or aspects in some cases, part of the LGBTQIA community. It's not a thing straight people have to do. And the reason for that is because our society defaults to the assumption that everyone is straight, despite collectively knowing that that is not the case. A coming out story is the process that people who are LGBTQIA go through as they work to accept their sexual orientation or gender identity and share that identity openly with other people. Coming out is typically viewed by many to be something brave, and in a lot of cases it very much is. It's an extremely personal experience, and while similarities can exist in the stories, every story is also different. Now, there is open debate around whether queer people should have to come out at all. On one hand, you have groups of people who don't think queer people actually exist, and we're just confused. Hopefully, the story I tell today gives you some insight that you can take with you. On another hand, you have people who believe that since straight people don't come out, queer people shouldn't have to either. And on another hand entirely, you have people who come out, and that varies on a spectrum. For some, it's simply a form of outward validation, and easy. For others, it's the hardest thing they've done at that point in their life. And of course, there's everything in between. I've long believed that understanding is the antidote to fear, and this belief has helped me in multiple facets of my life. My coming out story was full of understanding, once I became open to it and knew where to look. While this story is insanely detailed compared to some of the other stories I've shared, I thought it might be pertinent for people going through similar experiences. As you can probably imagine, being a girl in a southern state has a very specific set of expectations for your life, none of which are yours to determine. My biological parents expected me to be a good girl, a child seen and never heard. In fact, that phrase was something I heard daily, along with the phrase, "You'll be lucky to make it to 18. Little did I know they were right, at least in that regard. I was lucky to reach 18 years old, but not for the reasons they thought. For parts of this story to make sense, you need to know some things about the adults I had in my life growing up before I managed to at least put a foot on the ground. Let's cover my biological parents first, or as I now call them, my sperm and egg donor. My sperm donor is a man, or was. We're no contact now, so I have no idea what he's like. But he is a man who needed therapy badly, and never sought it because it was taboo. When I think back on who he was to me as a child, he went from being the man who carried me, half asleep, to my best friend's house down the street in the wee hours of the morning, because he was off to work before dawn, kissing me goodbye on my sleepy head, to a man whose temper would flare from nothing to something comparable to the white-hot sun in a fragment of a second for trivial things that sometimes were beyond my control. I just became the punching bag. Perhaps I reminded him of his mother, who I'm told I resembled and carry some of her traits that were also well beyond her time. I do know the relationship was rocky, but I could never meet her before she passed. Perhaps it was the drugs and alcohol he consumed. Perhaps both, or yet neither. My egg donor was much the same, though I can never truly remember her being a good parent, let alone a good person. Everything she did was calculated and manipulative, a puppet master of the world around her. She tricked me into multiple bad choices, which, while I take full responsibility for actually deciding to trust her again for whatever stupid reason I had at the time, no child should be manipulated by their parents or guardians. She was infamous for using people for her own needs and then discarding them when they no longer served her, and that didn't change with her children. Both of my creation donors treated me more as property, or as a prodigy to their lives, rather than an individual human being with my own thoughts and feelings. Numerous times in my young life, they punished me for not having perfect scores at school, or if my grades dropped by only a couple of points, I'd still be shamed and in trouble. While we didn't actively go to church past a certain point in my life, religion was a very huge influence in our household. Most of the Bible's preachings were regurgitated in some form or fashion, usually as a lesson for why I needed to behave a particular way. Shame was also strong in the house. I was always told to be on my best behavior so I didn't make them look bad. I was encouraged to go to church with my best friend, who was Catholic. My donors, while they weren't married, had a nasty split when I was about 7. My egg donor took me to Mississippi, where she'd grown up and her side of the family was. Took me right out of my 2nd grade class in the middle of the school year, leaving every friend I'd had since before school behind. I've always been able to make friends, but it didn't change how out of place and lost I felt the entire time I was there. There's an entire chapter of my life in Mississippi, but we're not going to get into that now. My sperm donor had met someone new, who eventually became my stepmom, and our relationship was complicated, bouncing between being supportive and then falling into the same behaviors my sperm donor exhibited. Once I got back home to Texas, I thought I'd be relieved to have my old life back, but it had changed entirely in the years I'd been gone. All my friends had grown from little kids to preteens or teens, and I felt lost and out of place all over again. And that's where this story really begins. Picture this, a 12-year-old little girl, having lived through things beyond her age, already beginning to learn the lessons of life. I was obsessed with Sailor Moon, Legos, sports, and video games. And Xena. She was a badass woman, confident, and a warrior who took no shit from anyone. She was fiercely loyal and protective of her loved ones. She was everything I was or wanted to be. Watching her learn to be vulnerable through her travels, letting her guard down, and building this relationship with Gabrielle gave way to my first gay thought that I can remember, which was, do I like her? Or do I like her? Now listen, there are people out there who will say that you cannot possibly know your sexuality that young. Honestly, if I'd had representation in books or on TV, things that would have helped me put a label to it and understand how I was feeling, I would have known a lot sooner. I've never truly crushed on boys, not the way I did with girls. And despite dating boys for a period of time when I was older, they just never made me feel anything. I knew what a crush was, and I knew that Xena made me feel exactly like that. I knew her sarcastic wit, dry humor, and ass-kicking was something that I was attracted to, even if I didn't understand the concept of attraction. I knew that I wanted to treat a girl at school the way that Xena treated Gabrielle. I knew I wanted to protect her at school and sweep her up on horseback and ride into the sunset to our next adventure. I knew I wanted to kiss her. And here's where we go back to the context of the adults I grew up with. I knew that they would think this was wrong. Everything they'd taught me said I was supposed to be this picturesque wife with kids, taking care of my husband's every whim and desire. To be a woman of God, they called it. Everything they'd taught me directly or said around me taught me that being gay was wrong. So I started wondering if it really was. In 6th grade, I fell strongly into comphet, or compulsory heterosexuality. If you don't know what that is, that's okay, because I just learned it a few years ago. But it's the theory that heterosexuality is assumed and enforced upon people by a heteronormative and patriarchal society. When I learned this terminology, I achieved an understanding in my adult life that I had long searched for. Like I mentioned before, everyone around me ingrained this idea and expectation that I'd wind up with a man one day. My sperm donor wouldn't care who the man was, so long as they were similar and found common ground in their beliefs, all the while threatening to kill him with a shotgun for even dating me. Men like this are so weird, I swear. My egg donor and stepmom would entertain the notion that my future husband would be handsome and strong like a fairy tale prince, and take me away to a home where I'd be free to live my days like a princess. Both of these women had careers, and for the longest time I could not figure out why they'd teach me to not want one. But the comphet was overwhelming, and it only got worse with the bus incident. I've shared that story before, but this was one of the pivotal moments in my coming out story. Only, it drove me further into the closet. Some kids called me a dyke on the bus, and I came home in tears knowing they were being mean, but not understanding the term itself. When I went to the person who was supposed to comfort me, the reaction was the opposite. In a rage, my sperm donor exclaimed that I'd better not be gay or he'd tie me up and drag me down the street behind his truck. Because again, the expectation was to be with a boy. Being with a girl was never presented to me as an option. I dismissed the feelings I'd had for this girl in school, and the daydreams of her being the Gabrielle to my Xena. Started avoiding her, which caused its own problems because she'd been my best friend, and we were always together in school. Thinking back on it, I'm sure the teachers thought it was strange that I suddenly stopped partnering with her for assignments. I squashed my true self into a box and compartmentalized the hell out of it. It became painfully clear that who I was, whoever that was, didn't fit into society, and there was no place for me in it. So off I went, searching for a boy to have a crush on instead, to meet the expectations set for me, only to find myself lost and out of place yet again. It occurred to me that if I was going to effectively avoid these bad things my sperm donor hated, I should probably figure out what they were. I remember asking the librarian for a dictionary one day at school to look up the words dyke and gay, because I had no idea what they meant, but context and experience had taught me that they were bad. At the time, gay was not defined as openly as it is today, so when I read the definition, I was confused because I wasn't a male homosexual. So I followed the words to the next definition, searching for understanding. Dyke gave me literally nothing, but said, "See also lesbian." And my search continued. The absolute gut-wrenching I felt when I learned that the words for who I was damn near destroyed me. I slammed the book shut and got a farewell scolding from the librarian for being too loud as I ran out of the library in tears. I was only 12, and I was surrounded by people telling me I'd burn in hell, or beat me or torture me without them even knowing I had ever had feelings for a girl. People wanted me to suffer, to literally die, for the mere speculation that I might like girls. I couldn't bear the thought of what they'd say or do if they ever knew the truth. I dated, and I say the term very loosely, a couple of boys in middle school. Most of the time was spent in extracurriculars avoiding my home life, since middle school is when the abuse started. I began killing myself from the inside out. I walked on eggshells everywhere because I was afraid of the abuse and afraid of someone finding out the truth about me. There were so many times I was worried about dying. On the bus ride home, at school, walking home from the park, in a locker room, and at home. I felt safe nowhere. And mind you, I was still 12. My head was full of anxiety and fear and doubt about everything. I was very much a tomboy, but I began worrying that I wasn't girly enough, and people would think that I was this gay thing, whatever gay was. So I let my so-called friends, aka the popular girls, do makeover after makeover on me. I hated makeup, and I hated having my hair down in my face. I hated skirts and bows. I hated being confined in a damn box and pretending to be someone I wasn't. While I was still terrified of the truth coming to light, I also began to rebel against myself. I fought with myself constantly, back and forth between who I was and who I wanted to be versus who I had to be. This rebellion manifested at home, making the abuse worse. To my sperm donor and stepmom, I was stubborn, troublesome, and I talked back with too much attitude. And that was the exact opposite of their expectations for the sweet little Southern Belle. At one point in 7th grade, I wound up in jeans that I'd cut myself and wore chains and a choker around my neck. Fashion statement, I know. They began sending me to school in lace dresses with my hair down. I began packing a change of clothes and hair ties in my backpack, and I would change at my best friend's house before heading to the bus stop. I got caught when they picked me up early one day from school. So they began waiting with me at the bus stop to make sure that I didn't change clothes. And then I started having my best friend bring me clothes to the school so I would change there. Where they saw willful stubbornness, I was headstrong and determined. I was going to keep playing sports and hanging out with my guy friends instead of the girls down the street. I wanted to play football and in the mud, not to play dolls and dress up. Where they said I was troublesome, I was refusing to follow their orders for things that made me uncomfortable. The tensions in my house escalated. Where they said I talked back, I stood up for my beliefs in justice and doing the right thing, and refused to cave to their pressure or society's. Until I did. Because fear is a very powerful thing. I was never a prim and proper girl who wanted to live her life for God and a husband. And no amount of church, emotional tirades, or beatings could make me behave that way. It just wasn't who I was. But I felt like I couldn't escape it. I buried my queerness so far down that I'd lost the idea of who I was entirely. But I knew who I wasn't. I felt trapped. In 8th grade, it finally broke me, for the first time, and that was when I became suicidal. A poem I'd wrote had been found unleashing my thoughts, and while I hid my queerness in the writing, it was still there, hiding under the surface of the words, like it was hiding under the surface of me. I'm going to share it with you because I think it's important to know that these feelings can live inside each of us for a whole manner of different reasons. And while it's certainly not my best writing and kinda cringy, remember that I was 14 years old and going through some shit, okay? I live in endless winter. Will spring ever come to follow? I wonder what to do when life becomes intolerable. Why must I live in this wretched life? Wouldn't the solution be to end it? How long do I have to wait to start over? For my brand new day. The hole in my heart is growing. It's my time. I'm done. I won't love anyone that can hurt me. I look to the sky for answers, but it's bleak and black, just like me. The anger is rising, unlike the sun, for I'll never bask in its warmth again. I hate what's become of me, what's happened to me. Forever cursed to carry on like this. I want to turn back time before all the wrong. I don't want to shed any more of these never-ending tears. I can't take it anymore. I want to run, but I just keep falling. I can't get away from all of it. Always hurting, always running. Please just let me die. Do you want my blood on your hands? Am I nothing but fear, anger, and hate? I have the solution to all my problems, but in the end, I'm still running, blood boiling and heart pounding, bleeding to death in a steady rhythm, slowly dying, coming to my demise, surrounded in shadows, drowning in despair. As you could probably imagine, there were awkward conversations that followed after they found that poem, and my rebellion with my stepmom and sperm donor had a brief ceasefire. They finally conceded I was too old for wearing the outdated outfits they chose, and gave way to letting me wear what I wanted, let me express myself. They began letting me live a little bit of life, but the rebellion still raged on within me. I had now buried my queerness so far within that I only identified as straight at this point, and queerness wasn't even a possibility. All of this happened just in time to start high school, which is where my entire world went from being a roller coaster to totally turned upside down. We're going to have to pause the story here, but stay tuned for next month's episode where we dive into the journey of self-reflection and awakening as I began sorting myself out. I truly hope that you found something for yourself in today's podcast, and I appreciate you being part of this dream of mine. I hope you consider joining me on this journey to aid one another. I truly believe that community is one of the most powerful things we possess, and if you're able and willing, please visit my Patreon at patreon.com/theaidpodcast to learn how you can be part of this community and help it grow. And remember, it may not be fine right now, but it will be. Stay safe out there, folks, and I'll see you next time for AID.